Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Greg Husisian to our podcast. Greg is a partner and litigation attorney with Washington, D.C. based Foley and Lardner, LLP. He is chair of the firm's international trade and national security practice, focusing on both international trade and international regulatory issues. Greg also serves as chair of the firm's international. He also focuses on both international trade and international regulatory issues, and other focuses of his practice include compliance and regulatory risk management. Before entering private practice, he clerked for the Honorable Jerry E. Smith of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Greg also holds a BA in economics from Cornell and also graduated from Cornell Law School. Greg, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be talking to you again.
Absolutely. Before we jump into the nitty-gritty of all things trade, Greg, can you just please provide somewhat of an overview of your firm and really your specific focus in your role as a trade attorney at Foley and Lardner?
Absolutely. So Foley and Lardner is an AmLong 50 law firm, which basically means we're quite large. We counsel companies all over the world, specifically regarding international trade and regulatory issues, which includes like OFAC economic sanctions, export controls, CFIUS national security reviews, and lately customs and tariffs, given the focus of the current administration on that. That takes all forms, including helping people comply with the customs rules, which are changing very rapidly, handling prior disclosures, responding to customs inquiries, and then everything except telling people exactly where the tariffs are going to end up at the end of the Trump administration, because as far as I know, no one knows that question.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. So guys, pretty interesting. A few weeks back, you were featured in a Wall Street Journal article which focused on battling trade fraud um, as tariff rates headed, and with the article saying basically as tariff rates headed up, so too do the incentives not to pay them. The article also highlighted how the Justice Department shifting white collar priorities to pursue tariffs and customs related cases more aggressively have helped create what it called a perfect storm for trade enforcement. So, with that sort of as a backdrop, Greg, can you please offer up your take on the situation? It really has a lot of moving parts in terms of how importers are actively seeking to evade tariffs illegally. I know that's a lot to unpack, but the article did a really good job, and I'd like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so there are two aspects to this. One is the increased incentives of importers to try to not pay their tariffs. And the other part of it is the enhanced ability and willingness of the US government to catch people who are doing that. The the enhanced incentives are very clear, which is there's been a massive increase in tariff rates, with the tariff rates going up by six or sevenfold over the last 6 months because the average
Yes.
rate was under 3%. And that is a huge change, particularly for frequent importers. It can be hundreds of thousands of dollars per container coming in, or even into the millions. So when you see those kinds of increases, and companies are wondering how they're going to handle it, unfortunately, some people think that it's like a video game to be figured out and
Right.
gamed, whereas really it's the equivalent of the IRS collecting tax rates. If tax rates go up, it doesn't mean that suddenly you get to play games. From the U.S. government's perspective, it's a lawfully due bill that you have to pay. So the areas where companies have an incentive is to try to change the country of origin, because now there's sharply different tariff rates for different countries, to try to undervalue the goods, to try to misvalue the goods to move them into a more favorable tariff classification, and to try to make goods that should not be considered to be compliant with like the USMCA to claim that they are. there's also incentives for companies to try to transship. So those are probably the biggest five areas where
Okay.
companies have an incentive, and where they potentially could unlawfully lower their tariff rates. What they're not taking into account, however, is that all this data is electronic and customs is using AI and doing data mining to compare your import data with all the other companies that are importing similar products. And they're looking for anomalies, and they have a very high chance of finding these areas because everything is now electronic. Also, the President Trump has indicated that customs is to impose the maximum possible penalties for underpayment of tariffs. And the DOJ has announced that tariff underpayments are now their number two enforcement priority after certain healthcare fraud. And so if you put it all together, you have an enhanced ability to find underpayments, an enhanced willingness of the U.S. government to go after it. The U.S. government's willing to bring the DOJ in a way that we haven't traditionally really seen on a large scale. So you put it together, like greater chance of being caught, greater willingness to go after you, greater penalties. And that's going up against a situation where there's greater incentives. And what we expect is that there's going to be a massive increase in the already high level of penalties that are being
Sure.
imposed on importers for tariff cheating.
Okay, great. That's terrific feedback. And also, Greg, kind of separate but related, with the White House earlier this month moving forward with this reciprocal tariffs, which are initially introduced and rolled out in April, but then subsequently paused. What are the key steps or priorities from a tariff enforcement perspective for U.S. Customs, given that this tariff fraud activity is occurring?
So the biggest um, item is for customs is we're seeing evidence that they are expanding their data mining and their use of AI to find items. That is something where they already have a strong basis and a strong program going on. So it's very easy for them to expand that. The second piece of it is taking a little bit of time, but we expect that to be in place over the next few months, which is to get the DOJ geared up and ready to go after people using the False Claims Act, and potentially on a criminal basis. So that requires more um, building up from scratch, because this hasn't traditionally been a priority DOJ item, but that clearly is ongoing. And the ROI on these enforcement activities is going to be immense, because with the amount of money at stake, what would have been a smaller tariff fraud in the past will very quickly lead to a very large underpayment of tariffs at the current tariff rates.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Moving on to a sort of separate subject here, Greg. Earlier this year, a three-judge panel at the United States Court of International Trade ruled that President Trump had misused the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEPA, of 1997, in steps he took to implement tariffs on various consumer and industrial products, with the White House then receiving a reprieve the next day. Then, late last month, the Federal Circuit heard oral arguments expressing significant skepticism about Trump's use of IEPA to justify those sweeping tariffs, noting that the statute does not explicitly authorize tariffs. Judges also questioned whether trade deficits qualify as an unusual or extraordinary threat under IEPA. The White House continues to appeal, and the final outcome may depend on whether the Federal Circuit or the Supreme Court affirms or overturns the Court of International Trade's ruling. How do you view this situation, Greg? And where do you think things might go from here?
So a couple of things. The first thing to understand is there's actually three different trade statutes that have been used for different types of tariffs. The first one is Section 232, which that's like for use for like the steel and aluminum tariffs, like the copper tariffs. There's ongoing investigations into like timber and lumber, and you've probably heard that semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are potentially coming. The use of Section 232, which has a very laid out process and requirements, was upheld in the first Trump administration because it was used to put in place the steel and aluminum tariffs. And those items are not impacted by the IEEPA case. And that's very important because the Section 232 tariffs undergird if when all the investigations are concluded, it's estimated that somewhere between 38 and 40% of all imports will be covered by those tariffs. And those are not impacted um, by the IEEPA litigation. The same thing
Hmm.
is true for the Section 301 tariffs, which, the use of Section 301, which was used for the China special tariffs up to 25% from the first Trump administration. So my guess is there's a pretty strong chance that the IEEPA tariffs, which are the reciprocal tariffs, which are being used for like the global tariffs worldwide, plus the special
Yes.
one, that those could be struck down by the Supreme Court. It's on very tenuous legal ground. IEEPA doesn't really mention tariffs, and to the extent that there is tariff authority, it's supposed to be temporary. And in fact, IEEPA was put in place in reaction to President Nixon trying to put in place global tariffs. And Congress said, like, that's not right. We're supposed to be doing that. We need to rein that in. So the
Hmm.
use of IEEPA is a bit ironic. The reason why Trump likes it rather than using like Section 301 or 232 is because basically you could just like do things on a whim. Like,
Sure.
oh, we're really annoyed at Brazil right now, so let's threaten, extra tariffs on them. So it gives like a huge amount of discretion, but that also makes it even more difficult to defend at court. My guess is, though, that even if the Supreme Court strikes it down, that they will go back and very quickly do a Section 301 investigation and use that as the authority. And in fact, if
Yeah.
I were in the Trump administration, I would be doing that right now, the belts and suspenders this thing, so that I have like a basis to as a backup. Like even if IEPA is struck down, I've gone through and done the Section 301, so I can just go over and use that as the basis. And I would be telling foreign governments like, hey, it doesn't matter if the Supreme Court strikes it down. We have other trade authorities to do this. So my guess is that it would be messy, and then we'd have the question of whether or not there needs to be a refund of the old duties, but that the Trump administration's trade team will come up with a way to support these tariffs using a different trade authority if push comes to shove.
Understood. Okay. Okay. And then, Greg, when we recently spoke, you had noted that in looking at the White House tariffs actions, they're very broad-based and hit companies in different ways. What are some of the ways in which you are seeing that in certain sectors? And as a follow-up, what are you hearing from your clients across different verticals in that regard?
What I'm hearing from the clients is you need to understand this is not just a huge tax increase. This is an attack on our entire business model. There's all sorts of companies that import like basic parts and components from abroad and then use it as a basis for adding value to the products within the United States so that they can focus on the higher value added areas. They're like sometimes companies are like we spent a huge amount of money to build a factory in China. There's other companies that are saying, you know what, after Section 301 duties, the administration was encouraging us to move to, Mexico, saying, why don't you nearshore? And now they're going after, our imports from Mexico.
Yes.
But as a result, a number of companies are saying like it took decades to build up this model, and it would take, 5, 10 years, something like that, to undo this model. But we don't know what to do because, when we're redoing these things, we often are looking like a new factory. We need like a 15 or 20 year um, time frame, and we don't even know what's going to. Are these tariffs going to be struck down by the Supreme Court? Are they going to be changed? Are they going to be negotiated away? Will a new administration do them? So the level of uncertainty is probably the universal reaction. Beyond that, the impact depends on what role the imports play. For some companies, they're like, we have no choice but to bring them from China. Do you realize that capacitors and resistors really don't come from any other place, for example? Other companies are like, yeah, we've got flexibility. We can start setting up like alternative or secondary suppliers. We can be more flexible and deal with this. Some companies actually can bring their stuff back to the United States. Other companies are like, you know what, it's just impossible. We can't do it. There's not the infrastructure. So it's hitting companies in very different ways. But I'd say the company that has the most consternation is not just like distributors, it's more the companies who have made this a part of their business model where
Yeah.
they have built up these intricate supply chains over years and qualified them and where their entire business model is based on that generally to support further manufacturing in the United States.
Okay, great, great. And then the White House recently rolled out a 40% transshipment tariff, Greg. How should supply chain stakeholders be interpreting, I guess, as well as uh, facing that? How do they handle in that transshipment, that 40% transshipment fee?
Yeah, so there's two different types of transshipments, and they tend to hit companies differently. The first kind is what people think of transshipment is, the goods are made in China, they ship them to, Malaysia or Vietnam or Mexico or something like that, and someone like takes the label off and puts a new label on.
Yeah.
And that's just like flat out customs fraud, and that's not hitting responsible companies. That's hitting people who are like out, tariff cheaters, for example. A Chinese company, which is like, you know what, we'll probably get away with this for a while, and if we're caught, then suddenly, my uncle will open up a new business which happens to sell the same products. It's
Hmm.
the new company, and then they're always like playing cat and mouse games with CBP, which is on its side would call it playing whack-a-mole. Uh,
Yeah.
the one that tends to hit companies, though, and where we're working with them, is a lot of companies pursued what they call the China plus one strategy. And a China plus one strategy would be like, well, we're going to get like certain key parts and components from China, and then we're going to ship them to like a factory in Malaysia or Thailand or something like that. And then they're going to like add more value and change it into a product of a new country, and then we can validly ship it. But what we find is a number of importers haven't really done their homework to make sure that they're doing enough in the other country to substantially transform the product. So with these transshipment tariffs in place, that's really important to do that. Um, when you're doing this China plus one strategy, to be certain that you've analyzed it so that if you're questioned by customs, then you can show that, you know what, we may be getting, some of our parts and components from China, but look how substantial the process is. It's sophisticated. It's not just like a screwdriver operation. It takes a lot of work. There's a ton of changes to the product. It changes in its name, character, and use. You want to be able to show that you have truly substantially transformed it. And I think a lot of companies, particularly that pursued this China plus one strategy that didn't really go through and do their homework, are going to get caught by these and get big back tariff bills.
Okay, interesting. Something I meant to ask earlier in our conversation, Greg, was just yesterday, the ongoing pause, if you will, between the United States and China related to tariffs has been extended for another 90 days through mid-November. I want to say it's November 10th. I can't remember the date. I don't have it in front of me. Um, what's the gist with that in your opinion? Is it more of the same? How does it set up things going forward? I mean, I just feel like, especially when it comes between the U.S. and China, we're living in sort of a world of pauses, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why the administration is willing to give the pause is because the tariffs are really high, even in the pause, because you have the 10% global tariff plus the 20% fentanyl-based tariff. So that's 30%. And then you still have the Section 301 tariffs, which are between 0 and 25%, most commonly at 25%. So that gives you 55% tariffs. Plus, there's a bunch of products from China that are under anti-dumping duty orders, which are on top of that. And then you still have the normal old tariffs, which seems kind of quaint, but they're up to like 6 or 7%, you know. And so it's being paused at a high level, while China in return is just imposing 10% tariffs on US exports, which are tiny in comparison to the Chinese exports.
Hmm.
So because of that, and and to avoid the like nuclear war option of going back to the both sides having triple digit
Yes.
tariffs, they're willing to to extend this. Um, and it's very clear that the China tariffs are going to end up at a high place. We just don't know exactly where they are, because remember, China never was willing to do much to negotiate away the Section 301 tariffs up to 25%. Other than they reached one agreement to prevent them from expanding. And those were considered pretty massive at the time. So I think that it is the case that both sides would like to come to some kind of agreement, but it's pretty likely that it's going to be at a high point, because China has the highest trade deficit with the United States by far, and that's very much the number that President Trump is focused on. Plus, they legitimately have the world's biggest manufacturing capacity, and they're dumping huge amounts of state funds into it, and pushing this because their economy is so export based.
Okay, great. And then just to wrap up, Greg, what are some kind of words of advice you would have for shippers, um, industry stakeholders that are up against all things related tariffs, in terms of how they can navigate them, how they can stay on top of things? I'm sure there's more than a few paths they could take. What are just some things you would offer up?
So a few things. One, you need to plan on us being in a high tariff environment for the reasonably foreseeable future. So you need to be planning that way. You need to be reviewing all of your contracts to be certain that you are explicitly have the ability to share tariff risks, with your supply chain, or to shift tariff risks, that you have the ability to pass on tariff risks to your customers. You need to be certain you've got that business and contractual flexibility that you can cope with things. The second thing is keeping in mind that in a high tariff, high enforcement, high penalty environment, that your customs compliance is more important than ever. So you need to be taking every possible step, like having a good customs manual in place, having a good customs classification index, working closely with your brokers, doing post-entry checks to be certain that you can catch any errors and correct them before liquidation, which is 300 days. That though all those blocking and tackling of basic customs compliance is 100 times more important in the current environment. The third piece of it is to be certain that your management understands this, like it permeates everything that companies do, from procurement, what products you're developing, what products you're going to be rolling out, how you design them. Like, tariff risk management needs to be thoroughly integrated into companies' operations in a way that it never really had to be before.
Sure.
And fourth, people need to be looking ahead and saying there's another tsunami coming, which is everyone's focused on the reciprocal tariffs, but our biggest trading partners are Canada and Mexico. In 2026, the USMCA is up for a mandatory review. So even though it's not getting the um, press right now. Companies that have significant sales within the USMCA region need to be risk planning for that as well and tracking what's going on there. So I'd say those are the key things that people need to be looking at right now.
Okay, understood. Great. Well, look, Greg, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to offer up a big thanks for spending some time with us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to discuss these issues whenever they come up.
Absolutely. Thanks. And for those listening in, Foley has a really great resource related to all things tariffs. The URL is foley.com/insights/category/blog/tariff dash international dash trade dash resources backslash. I'll include that when the podcast, I'll include a link to that when this podcast goes live. And Greg, you had told me earlier that in mid-October, October 15th, I believe, you have a tariff and international trade webinar coming up. Anything you'd like to tell the listeners about that?
Yeah, so we're going to be covering three topics that would be of interest to your listeners. The first is another update on both enforcement and where the tariffs are. And then second hour is going to be a deep dive into customs enforcement best practices. And I'm really excited about that piece of it because we're bringing in a former customs auditor to
Okay.
talk about how customs is doing these things. And then the third part is going to be on a different topic, which is the focus of the administration on cartels and transcriminal organizations, which is going to have a big impact on companies operating in Latin America. So all three of those are going to be covered at from 1 to 4 o'clock on October 15th. And it's a free webinar. So
Oh,
hopefully
great.
some of your listeners might be interested in that as well, because this is such a fast moving and changing area that by that point, there probably would be 18 more tariff proclamations to come.
Yeah, who knows? Um, and for those listening in, please don't forget to give us a follow on Twitter. That's simply at LogisticsMGMT. And also, please look out for our podcast at logisticsmgmt.com, supply chain, also supplychain247.com. And also, wherever else you get your podcast, just go ahead and enter Supply Chain 24/7 podcast, and it'll come right up. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. We'll catch up with you soon.